Mike Pezzullo, welcome to Powerlines.
Great to be here, Chris.
Now, look, I met you back in the 1990s, and I think then you were working in the office of Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, but you've had a long and storied career in the public service. You're head of Home Affairs, you've worked in the Department of Defence, you've worked across Foreign Affairs. But can I just take you back to the very beginning? What, as a young man, was it that inspired you to work in public policy?
Well, going right back to my school years and then university, I was always very passionate about public service, probably in the defence area, although not necessarily there, maybe one of the intelligence agencies. So I always had a passion for that. And of course, in Australia, that largely means going to Canberra. I was born and raised in Sydney, first eldest son of two migrant parents, my mum and dad. Went to Sydney University, but I always felt a calling to go to Canberra, not particularly because I wanted to live in Canberra, although I've really come to enjoy nearly four decades of life here. But it was really about working in the federal government, either in one of the intelligence agencies or defence. Why? Need to unpack that a little bit. I won't take too long. Deep interest in military history. I was always very much into military history, going back particularly the Second World War, right back to primary school. I can't quite remember what motivated me, other than I've got a very distinct memory of that very famous documentary, The World at War, you might remember, I think narrated from memory by Laurence Olivier. I was just absolutely enthralled by it, watched every episode, and this is before you could get streaming or the likes. You had to actually watch it when they broadcast it. We couldn't afford a VCR, or there's no videos, so you had to actually watch the television.
At the time it was on.
At the time it was on, and I was just glued. The whole Hitler's initial successes, Britain holding out, the Battle of Britain, Churchill rallying the troops, as it were, Russia coming in initially on Germany's side, then America obviously coming in after Pearl Harbor, the whole, and then right through to the development of the atomic weapon, the early days of the Cold War, and then the Cold War itself. So.
Yeah, but you're a deep thinker on geostrategic politics. It's something you've been really interested in for your whole life, by the sound.
Well, I probably started when I was about 8 or 9. So.
And read widely on it as well, and have watched closely as the big pieces move around the world through your career.
I remember in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. I was so enraged. I remember sitting down with a pad and my mum said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a letter to the Prime Minister about the kind of force structure we need because as the Soviet Union is expanding, getting closer to the Indian Ocean." I was a big proponent of an aircraft carrier, so...
You know, I remember that moment vividly too. I was a 19-year-old. I remember hearing it on the radio.
It was Christmas. Yep.
Yeah,
it was
and
Christmas,
thinking in those days, this could be it. This could be where the world goes to nuclear war.
Yep.
We thought about that then.
Christmas 79.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I can take you to a specific point in your history, the 2009...
I also like sport, by the way, so I wasn't a complete strategic and defence nerd.
I'm sure you're a man of many passions. But I want to take you to a specific point in your history in government, when you worked on the 2009 Defence White Paper, and you were largely responsible for the drafting of that. Now, when you look back at that paper... That seemed to be one point in time where we had an understanding of where the world might be heading and a recognition of the fact that we had to build towards what you called then, I think, Force 2030.
Force 2030.
So what was it that you saw and what were you trying to do with that paper?
Well, by this stage, in late 2007, I'd already been a Deputy Secretary of the Defence Department for a number of years there, working under Minister Brendan Nelson at the time. And then obviously the government changed when Mr Rudd came to the Prime Ministership. Very early in the piece, he'd identified a pre-election commitment to develop a whole new approach to defence. He wanted a deep review done of our strategic circumstances, possible threats, the net assessment of our capabilities versus potential adversary capabilities. So it actually fell into my lane as the Deputy Secretary for strategy in defence. That was the job. Mr Rudd honoured me at the end of 2007 by asking that I be appointed to lead the team under Minister Fitzgibbon. Joel Fitzgibbon was the Defence Minister at the time. What was I seeing? I need to be still very careful. I've got a lifelong obligation in terms of the intelligence that I've read, obviously over a very long career. I actually started in the Defence Intelligence Organisation, working in a team that was looking at Soviet forces in the Pacific, particularly submarines at Cam Bay. So I've held a high-level clearance, a top secret plus, for the best part of 40 years. So I'm going to be very cautious about what I say. But in essence, and just dealing with the publicly available material at the time, it struck the team, and we had a lot of engagement with both Minister Fitzgibbon and Prime Minister Rudd. They were deeply, deeply interested in this. It struck us that what we were seeing in relation to the modernisation of the PLA was just completely at odds.
That's the People's Liberation Army. We're talking about China now.
China.
Yep.
It was completely at odds, and I've written about this in the time since I've left government. It was completely at odds, in some cases for reasons I still can't disclose. In other cases, these matters have come to the surface publicly through the Pentagon's military power report, where they do these annual reports about the growth in Chinese military power. They were just weapon systems capabilities and an ability particularly to give themselves the option to confront American naval power and American air power in the Pacific that either didn't make sense if you were looking at China as a responsible stakeholder, the paradigm of the time, post the fall of the Cold War, post the fall of the Soviet Union, rather, in the post-Cold War world, was that China would integrate its economy. It would seek to resolve strategic tensions and disputes peacefully because it wanted to grow its own middle class. It wanted to have a prosperous development of its own economy and eventually move towards the consumerist service-based economy. And then outside economies such as Australia, the US and others could export things like financial services, aged care, health services and the like. That was the theory. It's not just the idea of the end of history, the Fukuyama theory about the increasing integration of economies, but it was also there was an economic logic that if you looked at China's evolution, this was where they were going. And this is years before President Xi came on the scene. What didn't make sense, and what was the tell that something else was going on in Chinese thinking, was their rapid, in fact, accelerating a development of capabilities that could only have one purpose, which is to give themselves the option, not a predetermined outcome, but the option to take on the Americans militarily. And we looked at this, and we spoke to the Americans at that stage before the election of President Obama. Obviously, the Bush the Younger was in office, and we were engaged with the Americans, with the British and others, saying, "What do you make of all of this?" Frankly, amongst all of us, I won't pick out any one country. There was a lot of shrugging of shoulders, saying,
I think one of the things about this white paper is that you're ahead of everybody in terms of where you see the strategic direction heading. I think the Americans were quite complacent at the time.
Not so much complacent. In fact, I go further. They were surprised at our judgments. They were deeply, deeply at that point involved and frankly, caught, some of them felt, in the quagmire of both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Secretary Gates, the Secretary of Defence, Robert Gates, was working hard to reorientate the Pentagon and the US military system to counterinsurgency, land-based operations where you're fighting non-state actors, principally militia and the like, and you're spending a lot of resources on national reconstruction, on improving things like sanitation, municipal services and the like. And meanwhile, there was a gentle atrophy starting to occur in terms of their air and naval power. Very interesting. Because they were trying to reorientate to the wars of the present, and we were thinking, hang on, defence planning should be about 10, 15, 20 years down the track. What's that world going to look like? Cut a long story short, and it is a long story, we came to the judgment in the white paper policy team, which obviously advanced options to the government of the day, that we needed to put a hedge against maritime and naval and indeed space and cyber warfare as potentially something that we would have to deal with in the 2020s, early 2030s, and certainly by the mid-2030s. And again, I want to stress, this is before President Xi then gets elected as the General Secretary and President a couple of years later.
Yeah, and so when you look at that, this is the first time that we start to hear about things like needing to have more submarines, needing to have, that's where that idea comes from. And if we'd pressed the pedal to the metal then, we'd be in a much better circumstance than we are now.
Mr. Rudd made it very clear that he obviously wanted to hear advice, but he had not so much a predetermined view, but an inclination to significantly strengthen our Navy. In fact, in a recent piece published with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, I've argued that he was the most alert Prime Minister to the requirement of naval sea power that we've had since Alfred Deakin. Deakin, at the turn of the century, one of the early Prime Ministers, was adamant that we would have a Royal Australian Navy with a very significant capability to deal with, at that time, Imperial Germany's Navy in the Pacific. We got HMAS Australia, that one of the largest battle cruisers in the world at the time.
Well, we seem to forget that we're an island sometimes.
Sometimes, but Deakin was a navalist. Yeah. The creation of the Royal Australian Navy in 1913, the acquisition of Australia, which the Germans feared. The problem in those days with a battle cruiser is the range of the gunnery. If you couldn't get close to it, it sinks everything because you can't put any shells back on it. HMS Australia's presence in 1914 was the main reason why the Imperial German Naval Squadron left the Pacific and went back to the North Sea. In fact, Emden never made it and was sunk, of course, in the Indian Ocean by Sydney. Fast forward to Rudd. He was very respectful of the need to get advice. So he didn't have a predetermined view, but he said, look, my inclination is I think we need a stronger Navy. He got the advice. CDF Houston, Angus Houston, Secretary Warner, Nick Warner were the two principals as the Secretary and the Chief of Defence, and I was the principal full-time advisor on these issues as the Deputy Secretary. We said, Prime Minister, we need longer-range submarines, possibly nuclear. I'll pause that and I'll come back to that in a moment. And we need to start building them soon so that as the Collins class starts to degrade over time, there's a new class coming in, and we actually think you need more than 6. And we did some modelling and did some classified things that I can't talk about, but essentially war games. And we came up with a doubling of the force. Now, had that plan, that element of the plan, been adhered to by Ms Gillard in 2010 and her successors, because of course Rudd then gets removed in the middle of 2010, June, I think, from memory. So it's about a year after the white paper. That program is then not so much terminated, but put on a slow walk. Had we initiated with the option available to do a Collins 2, or like a bigger Collins, a super Collins, longer, possibly with vertical tubes, longer range, probably air-independent propulsion, so it would have to snorkel less, so have to explode, snorkel fewer times. We think over a decade we could have hit 2020 with a construction program that would see a boat arriving probably every 15 months or so. So by now we'd have upwards of 4 or 5, maybe getting on to 6 of them. Added to remediated Collins, that would give us 12. And then as you just kept building continuously, the oldest Collins could then be decommissioned.
And this is a really important thing when you think about anything to do with defence. If you are going to do something serious, it has to be long-term, it has to be bipartisan, and you have to be committed to it, because you can't let supply chains go cold. They have to be continually building things.
And you can't let supply chains can't go cold, and you can't let go of your skilled workforce. So people like submarine naval engineers, for instance, the naval architects, these are very intricate machines, and a lot of the knowledge and skill is actually in their heads. So if we'd hit that program initiation in 2010, started building and started to deploy in 2020, by 2030 we would have had a force getting close to 12. There was an option. It wasn't stated in the paper, and I need to be cautious about cabinet confidences, but there was an option that we certainly had in our mind in the Defence Department then of considering a nuclear powered option in that period around the mid-2010, so around between 2014 and 2019, because the white paper that we're talking about set out a series which would have to have been done on a bipartisan basis of 5-yearly cycles of planning and recalibration. So you start in 2009 and just keep stepping for 25 years, every 5 years calibrating your plan, potentially accelerating or amping up some of your spend. And at some point in that cycle, those 5-yearly cycles, we would have looked at something like a Virginia-class acquisition.
Yeah, but to boil all this down, there were people who were doing the thinking back then. If we had stuck to the plan from then until now, we'd be much better circumstanced than we are now. And
Yes.
we're not blaming any particular government because it's all government. So as you say, straight after Kevin Rudd, we hit a slowdown of this program. And then we get new prime ministers. A new prime minister wants to do subs in Japan. And the next one wants to do the subs in France. And then we move on to the subs that are going to be nuclear powered and come from the United States or the...
Which is not to say, Chris, that they don't have the prerogative to do that, but it comes at a cost.
And the cost is we end up with nothing.
Whereas you look at the American system, not always, but in a number of program areas, things like aircraft carriers or their attack class submarines, going right back to President Truman and President Eisenhower. They make massive investments into these huge shipyards, and they just have rolling programs. And yes, there might be some tweaks. They might bring an order forward. They might delay an order. But essentially, that part of the defence industrial base knows that there are orders coming. They keep their workers on. They can actually afford, knowing what the orders look like, to have high-paying jobs, so good-paying jobs for skilled workers like welders and the like. So you create a long-term, in fact, decades-long industrial base. And then, if you need to, subject to the external circumstance that you face, you can then quickly mobilise. So if you need to arm up for war, like an impending war, at least you've got a base. We have no base.
So yeah, go back through that time again too, and you've mentioned a couple of times this was before Xi Jinping, because what happens when he comes to power in 2012, the entire world changes essentially as he becomes president for life, and he really amps up the military spending of China. It becomes much more aggressive place. When you look at Australia's defence capabilities at the moment, and let's remember that we just had 3 Chinese warships lap this country, and the thing that they learned from that was we were unable to lap our own country with our own navy. What did they learn from that, and what did we learn from that?
It's not entirely clear what they're up to. I think the best judgment that anyone can make, and Secretary Moriarty said this at estimates when he was asked directly, is it probably was a rehearsal for a wartime combat operation. Now, why they would want to sail a surface task force into the Coral Sea and then the Tasman Sea with a large cruiser that has 112 vertical launch cells, some of which would be equipped with the Chinese version of the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile. The only utility of that weapon is to take out high-value infrastructure, airfields, fuel dumps, tarmacs, dams, power stations, and the like. There's no other reason why you would fire a weapon such as the CJ-10 longsword cruise missile, which is there. It's essentially a rip-off of the American Tomahawk. Is it designed to intimidate us? Almost certainly. Is it, though, also a rehearsal, as Mr. Moriarty said? So they're drilling their missile crews in the vessel itself? Almost certainly. So they'd run diagnostics saying, we're doing a drill. How quickly can you get the missile ready to launch? You get green light saying, yep, okay, we've achieved readiness. They didn't fire the missiles, obviously, but they would have simulated it. It was protected by a destroyer and possibly, if not probably, a submarine underneath, but they had a tanker as well. So they had their own petrol station as they were sailing.
Which you need to go a long distance.
Correct. Our 2 floating petrol stations are both broken at the moment. We could not, in our own waters, chase them or tail them with a replenishment tanker because they're both at the moment having elements of their engine and their crankshaft fixed. It's extraordinary that a maritime nation with a proud naval tradition going back to Deakin and HMAS Australia, as I just mentioned, has no floating petrol station for its warships.
Let's just underline this too. They conducted a live fire exercise.
Not using the missiles, but using their guns
in the Tasman Sea. And unless I'm mistaken, the last time a non-ally conducted a live fire exercise off the coast of Australia was in the 1940s, and it was the Japanese.
Well, it wasn't an exercise; they were firing.
They were firing at us. But
everything that we've done, Russia never came down this far.
No.
With that kind of activity.
So this is an absolutely unusual experience for us, and something that we have done everything in our power since the Second World War to make sure never happened again. So if nothing else, the demonstration effect is that China doesn't have to declare war on Australia. It's in a position now where it can cut off all of our supply lines?
Um, just a little bit of nuance.
Yeah.
Even with what I would contend is an underweight force, so it's not a heavy enough force and it doesn't have enough platforms, it doesn't have enough mass, and it doesn't have enough hitting power. Even with the force we had now, we could have probably concentrated, if in anger, if this was a situation in anger, unless that task group came down with additional protection and several submarines, if we'd concentrated the whole ADF on it, we probably could have killed it. However, that's the whole ADF dealing with one task group, leaving the rest of the country bare. We need a much bigger force that's distributed, that can protect our approaches. And frankly, in wartime, you wouldn't want to be dealing with them. And God forbid, like no one wants this to happen, but military planners have to think about reasonable worst case. There's no point saying, oh, diplomacy will save the day, or it'll never happen, or they'll treat us nicely because we've stabilised relations and they're accepting our exports again of wine and lobster. If it came to it, say over a Taiwan scenario or there was something else happening in the Pacific, the only reason why we would be potentially in harm's way would be because, irrespective of who lives in Australia, it's such valuable strategic geography that you have to be able to, if not control it, then at least block it so that the Americans can't use it as a bastion or use its depth to support their operations in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. We could be a French nation. We could be a Portuguese nation. We could be a Spanish or Dutch nation. It would not matter who lived here. So it wouldn't matter that we're English speaking, some would say born out of the Anglosphere. We could be some other European settled nation. And Australian strategic geography is really critical to military operations, as we saw in the 1940s, in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean.
Well, the government would, of course, argue that we've repaired relationships to an extent now where there's, we've got the trade which was illegally taken away by China.
Yeah.
But if this is the way that they treat you when we're getting on well, that they're conducting live fire exercises off our coast, they now have a spy ship off the southern part of Australia. So how is that repaired?
Well, because I don't think there's one single balance sheet here, Chris.
Yeah.
So I don't think, and in fairness to both the government, but also to the Chinese side, both parties to the trade dispute would say, okay, we had some unpleasantness. We put 200% on your wine, for instance. That's now stabilised and we've sorted that out. Meanwhile, the PLA over here, they've got a job to do. I'm not saying that I appreciate their job they're doing, but they're professionals and they'd be thinking, if our bosses say to us, give us an option to cut off Australia, right, to cut off its links to America, prevent the Americans from flowing their forces from the West Coast, Hawaii and elsewhere down into the protected bastion of Australia, be it bombers or submarines down in Stirling, or their maritime patrol aircraft or their aircraft carriers. So Australia's a very safe bastion. It's a protected bastion because it's so large. An island, if you hit an island, of which there are many in the Pacific, then it's very hard to repair the infrastructure that's gone. In a place like Australia, you can potentially move your forces around because we're an island, but we're a continental-sized island. So if you're a PLA planner, you probably might not even be aware that the lobster trade was impacted or, the wine trade was impacted. I mean, the government knows. You're just doing your job and you're saying, the bosses asked me within my military chain of command to give them options to one day attack Australia.
So how do we do our job, given we didn't do what we should have done in 2009 and gotten up to the stage where by now we'd be in a pretty good position to be able to defend ourselves? What can we do now quickly to get to a position where we can at least present a much harder target?
There are a number of key gaps that have to be remedied very quickly. I mentioned earlier that the original submarine plan, for instance, which obviously went off the rails, involved a remediation of the old columns. None of those have been given their life of type remediation or extension. That decision was taken in 2009, and here we are 16 years later, and the first boat still hasn't gone in for its refurbishment. So it's a classified matter, and I don't know what the number is, and we don't want to advertise it. But of the 6 that we have, it's not clear how many we could put out in anger, whether it's 1, 2, 3, at a stretch maybe 4. I don't know, and it's not something that
on that, you'd need 3, wouldn't you? You would need 3 in order to be able to keep 1 at sea.
At a minimum. So 6 can get you 2 out at sea, but at a stretch, if you fatigue the crew and just accept that you're not work in the 3-to-1 ratio. You could get 3, maybe 4 at a stretch. The reason why we wanted 12 was to be able to get at least 4 out. So typically military logic is you've got 1 out, you've got 1 back recovering, resting, rearming, and then you've got getting 1 ready to go out. But in a war, you throw everything out. So 12 would give you more options. Okay, we don't have 12. Of the 6, how many can we put out? That's classified, and frankly, we shouldn't be advertising it, even if, although some journalists would like to splash it over their newspapers. And I understand why. So we don't have early availability of either the nuclear-powered submarines or refurbished Collins, because that's just simply not possible in the next couple of years. So do we go with long-range submersibles, long-range autonomous vehicles? Autonomous vehicles undersea can do some of the jobs that a submarine can do, but they typically are one-shot jobs. So they might be able to go out and conduct intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance, but then unlike a submarine that can then be retasked because it's carrying torpedoes and missiles to do other jobs, that drone, that underwater drone's gone out to do one job. So maybe a dispersed fleet of 15, 20, maybe 30 one-shot or one-use long-range undersea autonomous vehicles might fill the gap temporarily until we get the Virginias in the 2030s, and maybe we can come back and talk about the AUKUS Virginia acquisition. I certainly would be looking at remediating Collins as quickly as I could, but that's going to be that'll be several years.
Yep.
I'd be looking to remediate the Anzacs as quickly as
These
possible.
are our frigates.
The frigates, but making a decision quickly on the new frigate, which has now been down selected to 2, either the German variation, which is actually the Anzac that we now have, but several descendants from that, or the Japanese Megami, which is a remarkably advanced ship, but never been exported. So the German ship, which is very good, has been, they've got a strong export tradition for their frigates. The Japanese do not. The Japanese have innovated some remarkable technology for the Megami class. We need to make that decision fast. And then the other thing we need to look at, and there are some production line difficulties here, but there are some in-service capabilities that we just simply need more of. So more P-8 Poseidons, more of the Triton long-range maritime surveillance drones. We should accelerate the acquisition of long-range anti-ship missiles, which we are getting, but in too few numbers. I made a suggestion recently as a stopgap. It's a radical suggestion, but one that should be looked at, to get a small fleet of B-1 Lancer bombers that the Americans have repurposed into anti-ship strike bombers. So they were designed for overland bombing missions back in the 70s. They've been completely rebuilt to carry 36 ship-killing missiles. So that's the B-1 Lancer. Very expensive platform, exquisite platform, but it can do the job. And there's a whole range of things that you can do as if you like patchwork fixes on what should actually be an elegantly developed force by now that should have gone through the following 5-year cycles. We should now be benefiting from a force that we evolved in the 09 5-yearly cycle, then the 14 cycle, the 19 cycle, and then we should be in the 2024 cycle.
And we missed all of these marks.
All of them.
The other thing too is that it strikes me that what the Chinese Communist Party did after, I think it was Bill Clinton, sailed the aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait, and they realised there was nothing. There was nothing they could do that. What they did was they covered the shoreline in area denial missiles. So they used the mainland of China to make sure that you could never sail aircraft carrier down there again without huge threat. And surely we should be doing the same thing, make ourselves into a position where we put stuff on Christmas Island, where you come in, and that's a long way from Australia. You come within that range, you at least run the risk of being in danger.
The good news is that the DSR, the Defence Strategic Review of 2023, but building on a key update that the Morrison government did, not much talked about, but the 2020 recalibration of defence started to take us down that path. The Albanese government commissioned Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith to do a review building on that. They did a very good job with the 23 DSR, Defence Strategic Review. That was turned into the National Defence Strategy in 2024. Still too light a force, not arriving quickly enough, not enough punching weight, and not enough dollars from my point of view, but heading in the right direction. And to your point about area denial and just holding approaching forces at risk at longer range, acceleration finally of the Tomahawk program, but also critically a program that's down to, I think I'm right in saying, two competitors, a long-range naval strike missile that we can forward deploy into certain locations and use the value of our geography or the benefit of our funneling geography. So to get to Australia, you've either got to go the long way out into the Pacific and then come through the South Pacific Islands, as the Japanese tried to in 42 into the Coral Sea, or you have to come around Christmas and Cocos and approach us through the Indian Ocean, or you come down through the Straits. Now, whichever way you do it, you're either going a very long way, which means you can be detected and dealt with at range, or you're coming through very narrow straits, and we can be, without getting too much into detail military war plans, we can be sitting effectively in maritime ambushes.
How much confidence do you have that if everything went to plan and governments didn't change their mind, as we've seen they have done so often, that we're going to get nuclear submarines?
That's it's a complicated question for this reason alone. The Americans, who are very keen on the program, both Republicans and Democrats, because it gives them two additional partners and it can spread some of their risk. They're very keen on the program. Here is the rub, and it's the point that Malcolm Turnbull and others, Peter Briggs, a retired admiral, have been making. The US requirement itself, stated to the Congress, so it's public, I'm not, again, disclosing any classified information on the public record, they need 66. They've got 41. So even if they amp up their production rate, a president is going to be required actually by an act of Congress to certify that, okay, we're still short, but selling to the Australians is not going to do irreparable detrimental harm to the US Navy's capability. So we have to, because that's going to be on the advice of the Secretary of the Navy and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defence, we've got our work cut out to say, you won't suffer a detriment because we're with you, both in terms of the industrial production, perhaps the maintenance. So there's a value proposition here that, because we have to build a maintenance capability ourselves.
And the deployment.
Now, here's the rub on the deployment. There's been a lot of talk about there's a secret clause to AUKUS and all the rest of it. No, it's called ANZUS. ANZUS committed us in 1951 to fight alongside or give consideration to fighting alongside, because there's no Article 5 element in ANZUS, which is similar to NATO, but we're required to give all consideration and to act in the common defence if either party is attacked in the Pacific area. The Pacific area, which Percy Spender negotiated that phrase back in 51 when he negotiated the treaty, has never been defined. So the Pacific area could be anywhere from the Aleutian Islands right down to the waters, to the north of Australia and the Western Pacific, and it could involve, US forces in Japan, US forces in Korea being attacked, US forces around Taiwan. I think it's good to have some flexibility and indeed a degree of ambiguity in relation to what exactly does that mean. But the bottom line is this: if the Americans were fighting, and God forbid it doesn't come to this, and I think the chances of it coming to this are actually on the lower side of probable, because I think what will happen is, like in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, we might get to a precipice and then
people pull back.
Everyone will pull back saying, hang on, because once this starts, it potentially goes nuclear, right? But let's say we get to a second Pacific War of some description, even if there's moderation initially in relation to nuclear weapons. To be honest, Chris, I think whether or not we have American forces here or not, if you're a Chinese planner, you've got to at least consider striking infrastructure in Australia.
You've got to take out Pine Gap.
Possibly not for this reason. Pine Gap, for reasons, again, that I can't discuss, is incredibly valuable from a certain point of view, but it's also valuable, and this is on the public record, in terms of ballistic missile early warning. When Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defence, he and Robert Ray agreed to shut down a site down in Narungga in South Australia and to move a certain capability, which is disclosed and publicly known, to Alice Springs, which is the infrared steering capability that gives the President early warning that ICBMs have been launched, intercontinental ballistic missiles.
That's a hugely important facility for them.
And if you blind the Americans by taking out Pine Gap, a president has to give consideration that you're about to strike with intercontinental.
You have to assume they're on their way, or there's a possibility
because you're blinded.
Yep.
So we don't know, but we think during the Cold War, the Soviets took a deliberate war planning decision not to strike that South Australian facility known as Narunga, which is just up the road from Adelaide, simply because it would blind the Americans in terms of the infrared flashes that you would get of missile launches. And that actually destroys stability and confidence, because once that's struck, a president has to calculate they're coming.
But in the event of a Pacific War, and both of us think that this is on the low side,
Yes.
but where might that start? So everyone talks about Taiwan, but there's been a lot of activity off the Philippines at the moment. Any of these places, a place where a mistake could
Japan,
lead. Yeah.
You could have a Chinese show of force against islands that the Japanese call the Senkakus, or the Diaoyu, as the Chinese would call them. Secretary Hegseth was just in Tokyo recently saying that we stand shoulder to shoulder and we will meet our commitments to defend Japan. Now, he's also asking that defence spending be raised, and maybe we can come back to the question of defence spending by allies. He was in the Philippines. You're absolutely right. It might well be that there's a show of force against the Philippines, and the Americans decide, as they're doing in the Indian Ocean now, to move aircraft carriers into position to say they're our ally. You will not touch them. Now, the big headline scenario, of course, is Taiwan, but no one should assume for a moment that the Chinese, if they're thinking of using military force at all, and again, we don't know. We can just go again off. I sound like a broken record, but we just have to go off public information rather than anything that.
But that public information tells us that Xi Jinping thinks that that is something that needs to be settled, and sooner rather than later.
So we know. So there's one public expression of this that's authorised to be discussed, which is when 2 years ago now, Bill Burns, the then head of the CIA, gave a really interesting and important speech at Georgetown University. He was a sitting CIA director, and very unusually for a CIA director, he didn't say as a matter of conjecture or we judge or we estimate. He said as a matter of intelligence. Now, he was signalling, as a matter of intelligence, we know, not we judge, we estimate, we think. We know that the president, who's also, of course, the head of the military in China, is the head of the military commission, the Central Military Commission, has ordered the Chinese military to be ready in 2027 to use military force to resolve the Taiwan question. And Bill Burns, who's very careful, but Bill is a very distinguished, long-serving State Department diplomat. He would not be speaking recklessly or wildly, and I suspect he would have done it with very careful calibration with the White House. He said, we know this is a matter of intelligence. So they've got some insight into the decision-making processes, at least as of 2 years ago. This was at the start of 23 when Burns said this, that said, this is the runway that Xi's thinking about to be ready. Now, why 27 as opposed to 26 or 28? They've got a lot of preparatory work to do, including making sure that their own systems are rehearsed, practiced and tested, because they don't want to do this once and get it wrong. And that includes things like, we just spoke about ballistic missile early warning. According to open press speculation, it's not entirely clear that they've got confidence that they've got the steering capability to be able to detect big American missiles being launched, and it's going to take them a couple of years to get that capability.
If you were to take Taiwan, though, there are a series of things that you would have to do in order to defend yourself. One would obviously be that surely the biggest threat to you are the US forces in Japan. There's Guam. And then, of course, as you say, Australia now plays a larger role. So all of those would have to be taken into account. And you would think that
as well as the immediate Taiwanese defence, because even though you look at a map and you think that the strait's quite narrow, it's actually not. It's a very long run. It'll be the longest at scale, longest run amphibious operation in history, bar a couple of American operations in 44 and 45. But the Americans got to those operations in 44 and 45, having shed a lot of blood, learning how to do complex amphibious operations in 42 and 43. They got a lot of things wrong. But they were, by 44 and 45, experts at long-range amphibious operations. Admiral Paparo, who's the current head of Indo-PACOM, the main combatant command, the combatant command that covers the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and again, like Burns, speaking carefully but but publicly about classified matters, has said, subject to the directions I get from the president, I can turn the area around Taiwan, and he's used this phrase, and it's on YouTube, he's said it at a speech, I can turn that waterway into a hellscape using capabilities that I can't discuss and that I won't discuss. Now, you can speculate what's he talking about, drones, sea mines, sea torpedoes, classified capabilities that potentially go through the air, on the water and underwater. We just don't know. Admiral Paparo, of course, has not given that away. So, yes, you're right that there are these forces around Taiwan, Japan, Guam, potentially Manus Island, where the Americans are building a facility there, and Northern Australia. But there's also the close-in defence of Taiwan as well.
And I want to underline, I assure you that you do want to too, we're speculating now about the worst-case scenarios, but when you're planning in defence,
yes,
that's what you have to plan for.
In fact, I'd say these are reasonable worst case. So the model we used to use, certainly in 2009 when I was there, was RWC, reasonable worst case. So they're not worst case in a reckless sense. They're reasonable worst case, but so they are at the outlier range of horrible possibilities, but they're well within the range of probabilistic thinking.
And that's why you have to plan for them. That's what you should plan for, because if you don't plan for that, then if it happens, you're underdone, and we're underdone now. So what do we need to do in terms of defence spending? And you've worked in the Department of Defence as well. I would like to see them spend the money that they get now a little more wisely than they do before I give them a whole lot more money. But more defence spending, but also more personnel.
So at the moment, they're just about to hit about 60 billion per annum, very large amount of money. And yes, of course, as taxpayers, we all want that every single last dollar to be spent efficiently. We want them to be lean. We want high levels of efficiency in that spend. That goes without question. Even if you maximise the value of every single last dollar of that 60 billion, which is the current appropriation for the forthcoming budget, it's about 60 billion in round terms, you still are going to fall short of all these other capabilities. Why? Because as the AUKUS Pillar 1 program comes into view, so it comes forward through the forward estimates and starts to land in the current budget year, you're spending quite properly so much on the infrastructure, the construction yard, the maintenance yard, supporting the US industrial base with payments that recently Mr. Miles made when he visited Washington. You're starting to put money into the design of the SSN AUKUS, a co-developed boat with the British. That starts to take up such a significant proportion of your budget that what you're doing is you're shedding a whole lot of other capabilities that you need. So I'll give you three quick ones.
And the complaint around this town at the moment, by the way, and we're in Canberra, is that in fact there's not a lot of defence spending going on because everything is being sucked into the submarine program.
Correct. And here's three concrete examples. One, they keep slipping, both for technical reasons but also funding, the fixing of those replenishment ships. So the engine and the crankshaft, publicly been exposed at estimates. We haven't had an oiler, a refuelling tanker, for a couple of years now. Mine countermeasures vessels, I think they're down to 2. So these are vessels that go out and using very advanced techniques. In the Second World War, when you watch your war movies, they used to sweep mines by cutting the cables and then blowing them up. Much more sophisticated these days, but they require specialised ships. By the end of the year, I think it's the end of 25, if not early 26, we'll have no mine countermeasures capability. You could mine a port, Gladstone, Port Kembla, Newcastle, any port, and we'd have to call someone, the Americans, the British, the French, can you come and clear a channel into our harbour because it's been mined. And the third example that I would proffer as a data point to support that contention is for years, in fact, going back to the 2009 white paper, we said we're going to have to look at an ability to defend against ballistic and other missile attack coming into particularly critical infrastructure and military bases. We have no interceptors. So through our intelligence systems, through means that I can't discuss, we might well detect a launch, we might see the launch, and we just watch the missile come in potentially through means that we're not able to discuss. We cannot send an interceptor unless the Americans pre-position one of their batteries or a number of their batteries. So when you're someone like Bridge Colby, and this is what I think he was getting at when he gave his testimony last month at the start of March to take up the position the American equivalent position of the job I used to be in, the Under-Secretary of Defence for Policy. They're saying, look, we love the Australians, love working with them. They need to be spending about 3% of GDP on defence, not as a shakedown or some kind of payment to America, which is sometimes the sort of the glib headline, because they've looked at capability gaps and they're saying the more gaps you have, the more we need to cover.
We are guilty of what the Europeans get accused of, which is essentially we have outsourced our defence to the United States and spent our money on something else. We now need to reconsider that equation.
So if our ports get mined, and again, reasonable worst case, not likely to happen, but let's say our ports get mined. We say to the Americans, yep, we want your military convoys coming in, set up for a counterattack in Australia, which potentially would be something that an Australian government would have to give consideration to, hypothetical scenario. But oh, by the way, all of the eastern seaboard ports have been mined. Can you send down a mine countermeasures squadron to clear the mines? They'd look at us and go, what? But we want to work with you. We love our alliance with you, but we've also got to clear your ports as well. We're busy, defending the free world, and we've got to clear your ports. And then we go, oh, but by the way, we have no defence against screaming incoming ballistic missiles. Can you spare us a couple of your batteries that shoot down missiles either in their exo-atmospheric phase or their terminal phase? They go, sorry, we're short of those batteries ourselves, because we're very big, but we've got global responsibilities. You haven't spent enough to develop mine countermeasures capability or submarine. You haven't refurbished your Collins. You haven't gotten missile defence interceptors. Now, they would say, look, that's your sovereign decision. But what it means is that we have to cover that if we're going to fight together. And that imposes a cost. So why should our taxpayers cover your...
And when expressed like that, you can begin to understand why President Donald Trump, and there are good things that he does and bad things that he does, but what he does on this front is completely understandable. He's essentially saying to all the allies, you pay for bearing the burden of your own defence.
Trump is no different, but he's approaching it very differently. But he's no different from every president going back to Nixon. Nixon was the first president. So after the phase when Kennedy famously said, pay any price, bear any burden, when America was spending 7% of GDP on defence. And they were doing it for their own reasons. They were developing ICBMs. They were developing the space program that had knock-on effects to the military. They were developing the most advanced jet fighters known in human history. They were spending 7% of GDP. And Kennedy said, yep, that's the burden of freedom. And everyone went, clapped and said, that's great, isn't it wonderful? By the time you get to the late 60s, in 69, Nixon says, wait for it, in Asia at least, so NATO will treat separately, but in Asia, you have to defend yourselves unless you're about to be overwhelmed. He said that in July 1969 when he was on his way to Vietnam, and he stopped off in Guam. It's known as the Guam Doctrine. That was 1969. So have we not got the memo that, yes, America will honour its treaty commitments, that's what it says, but before they do that, you've got to maximise your ability to defend itself so that the contribution they make to your defence is at that margin where you can't possibly cope. So, for instance, no one's suggesting that Australia could deter someone from striking it with nuclear missiles by having its own nuclear missiles. No one's demanding that. But what they are saying is you've got to do simple things like be able to shoot down missiles coming into your airfields or clear mines from your ports. Every president since, particularly since about Clinton, has said the same thing. Allies have to increase their burden sharing and spend more on their own defence so that our taxpayers are not cross-subsidising your taxpayers. Trump's really the first one who said, hang on, I'm sick of this. I've now got, through both tariffs, but also through just the force of my diplomacy, I've got a series of tools that I'm prepared to use. Now, he uses the phrase, you have to pay, as if you're paying an insurance premium to America. What I think he typically means is you have to spend more on your own defence so that I can work with you, but do less on the things that you should be doing for yourself.
And the thing that people miss with all of the stuff that Trump's doing at the moment too is that one of the objectives of everything that he's doing is to try and get under control a multi-trillion-dollar debt problem that is growing at the pace of about $1 trillion a year. So part of this is he needs to rein in some significant areas of spending and raise some money, which you can't raise taxes on. So I'm assuming that's what the tariffs money is going to go towards, which is trying to haul in the spending in the United States.
Well, and obviously he's got to be careful that he doesn't bake it in structurally, because all you're doing then is adding a tax on imports on top of income tax. So he's got to be careful he doesn't overtax the American people. So at some point there's got to be a rebalancing. You'd assume if they're going to keep tariffs high and create what they call an external revenue service, they have to think about tax breaks for the middle class. But the other thing he's trying to do, which has got a more direct geopolitical benefit, is to radically deindustrialise China. The tariff that was levied yesterday on China at 34%, which is additive to the 20% already imposed, is 54%, and they've got headroom for another 34%. That will, if that Chinese manufacturing can't find another outlet, then China will start to deindustrialise in its manufacturing sector. So what's going to be really interesting in the next few weeks is whether Mr. Trump uses the leverage that he's now created. So let's take an example, Vietnam, 46, they got 46% yesterday. He might say to Vietnam, look, in future, we'll continue to take your microwaves, your toys, your apparel, your clothing, your shoes. Factories like Nike, companies like Nike have put their factories there. But instead of buying Chinese computers or telecommunications gear or space technology, we've got wonderful American technology. So when you start thinking about your 6G network, and remembering that their 5G network might well be riddled with malware and espionage risks, why don't you put American telecommunications in? And if you do that, our trade will start to rebalance. I'll turn that number down. Now, if he pulls that off, it's a high-risk, high-reward strategy, and he blocks the outflow of Chinese manufacturing and Chinese exports, particularly to Europe, but also to Japan and Southeast Asia. China will have no choice but to significantly deindustrialise. For this reason, Chris, they are about 20% of global GDP on a purchasing power parity basis. They're about 20%. Manufacturing, they have 33% of global share. So what they've done is they've hoarded a whole lot of manufacturing. You see this in EVs, you see it in ships, shipbuilding, you see it in solar panels. They've deliberately hoarded. So there's a lot of smart people with Princeton PhDs in economics pouring in on Trump saying this is all lunacy. And there are some issues there about the inflation impact. You see the stock market has been smashed, the Dow, the S&P 500, NASDAQ, etc. So there are some, if you like, classical economic effects that could have been predicted. But you see through that, and those markets will correct. And as long as the inflation impact on American consumers is something that the American president's happy to cop, because at some point people are going to start complaining about those prices, you see through that and you think, hang on, if he manages to put these blocking tariffs in play, so say again with Vietnam, you start to get more American exports going to Vietnam for high tech, so high value added. You still see Vietnam pushing microwaves, toys, shoes into the US, but you've got strict enforcement of rules of origin. So Chinese companies can't backdoor into America by, say, setting up in places like Vietnam or Mexico or Canada. China's cornered at that point. Now, it depends on what the Europeans do. Xi then faces an exquisite political and geopolitical dilemma. Do I actually succumb and start to shift my economy structurally in the way that I frankly should, which is consumer-based, financial and other human services, less emphasis on export-orientated manufacturing. So you start to get that disparity down between 20% of global GDP, but 33% of global manufacturing. So I start to rebalance out. Remembering people have been pouring onto Trump for his poor economics, but they give China a leave pass with their predatory practices. How do you reckon they got a third of global manufacturing? Do you reckon because they had comparative advantage in everything? So does the Ricardo model of comparative trade advantage, has that sort of just naturally formed itself so that, China builds, with the exception of Japan and Korea having some of the market, nearly all the world's ships. Now, gosh, how did that happen? Predatory practices, subsidies, regulatory control, smashing little shipbuilders through cut price. Comparative advantage works fine in your Princeton or MIT or Harvard economics PhD. But in the real world, where economics intersects with power, economic development is guided by political imperatives.
One point on this, though, if China stops needing all of that manufacturing or it evaporates, it won't need our iron ore.
Yes, absolutely. But you don't think they're working on different and more efficient ways to get value out of the iron ore that they could get out of, less so Brazil, but certainly out of West Africa? They're working on that now.
But again, where is the planning in Australia for what is an obvious thing out of all of this? It is we continue to rely on a few major exports, and those exports might evaporate.
Donald Horne, the lucky country. A lucky country, first-rate country run by second-rate people.
And clearly we've seen through all of this conversation that's just it. It is a failure to make decisions at a point in time when they were there to be made that is at the root of all of our current problems.
Correct.
So how do we go about fixing it? But one of the things that I want to talk to you about, and I actually just got through the first page of the many notes I had on you because you cover so much ground and I'll need to let you go soon. But one of the things that irritates me about when we talk about the defence of Australia, sure, and all of that stuff we talk about and the kit that we need for offshore is fine. I worry more often about what's already happening behind Australia's borders, what I have witnessed happening with the Chinese Communist Party's influence, as we saw going back several years now. It was paying money into our major political parties. It was doing so basically without anyone calling time on it. When time was eventually called on it, then they moved into other areas. You know what's happening in the cyber world at the moment. We suffer daily attacks, but they're also stealing our intellectual property. People are being coerced in our own country by the Chinese Communist Party. What do we do about homeland security? And you were the former head of Home Affairs. How do we harden that target?
In the interest of brevity, because we could, because this is another massive topic that we could spend the equivalent, if not more, time. Of all of those issues, the one that really kept me awake at night was pre-positioned cyber sabotage, because that's the other issues are manageable, and certainly at a human level, there's a lot of impact, particularly if a dissident's been harassed or someone's been surveilled by the MSS or MPS. You saw what happened, and you've written about this in your own journalism. You saw what happened with Foxhunt, which was ostensibly an anti-corruption campaign, but it was really the MPS, the Ministry of Public Security, really targeting people that were risks to the regime or threats to the regime. They were dissidents, they were liberals, they were democratically minded. And so regrettably, for a while at least, we thought cooperating with the Chinese police on anti-corruption investigations kind of made sense. And then when you sort of peeled it back, you said, hang on, this is actually chasing dissidents. All of that's manageable. And at the human level, I don't want to diminish the harm of that. What is really harmful, though, in all of the things you've just sketched out, was pre-positioned cyber sabotage. Very difficult to talk about because it's very highly classified.
But again, the head of the FBI has spoken about this.
Correct, except insofar as, so going back to my ability to leverage off what Bill Burns said about 2027 and intelligence on war plans for Taiwan, in this case, Director Ray, former Director Ray of the FBI, but also former Director Nakasone of the NSA, the National Security Agency, and the new director there, Tim Hawke, have all spoken about their concerns about pre-positioned malware that has no purpose. It serves no purpose in terms of extraction of information or scooping up data or providing some kind of espionage vector. It's really designed to be animated, to be activated so that you take down critical infrastructure, whether it's, and they've used examples around water, power, energy, otherwise air traffic control, etc. That is a non-kinetic version of some of the things we talked about earlier. So mining a port is kinetic. You put a mine in the ocean and it blows up a ship. This is non-kinetic, but potentially has just as ruinous, if not more ruinous effects. And
so the next war, when it begins, might be when all the lights go out in this room and your phone no longer works. Because...
Well, in fact, it'd probably be a hybrid of things. So all of those things would happen, and then ships start exploding off one of our ports. So in other words, you might have a mix and match hybrid strategy, which is both a combination of non-kinetic and kinetic action.
And after you drew my attention, by the way, to what was being said in the United States, I went on an investigation here, and I find the same threat exists in Australia. People are aware of it. When I drew it to their attention, people in authority seem reasonably sanguine about it. Again, I don't understand.
Well, that's because we're trained to have a very
that's the
impassive face, Chris.
Sometimes I think that's true.
I've still got it even as a private citizen.
I think that's true of you, but I fear that some people in positions of authority in Australia have barely thought about it, or think that it's not really a problem.
I'd rather not comment, except to say, in fairness to both my former colleagues and those current serving colleagues, we have world-leading legislation, a regulatory framework around protecting our critical infrastructure, security of critical infrastructure, which is a testament both to the then government, the coalition government, supported by the Labor opposition at the time, to pass that legislation whereby the government has got the sorts of powers that you would see in wartime to provide physical protection of civil defence. Our government has, at the federal level, the powers to give directions in cyber that would be the equivalent of putting, sandbags around a bridge. World leading, and so I would respectfully contend to you that is not the, if you like, the result of sanguine behaviour.
All right, so
it might be impassive and it might be calm, but I can tell you there was a lot of focus that went into that regime.
Well, good. I'll give some of them the benefit of the doubt then. Look, just to finish on this, because you've been very generous with your time, when you look at the world at the moment, what are the things that you see and what are the things that concern you most about the way that Australia is positioning itself in these times?
I think we've touched on quite a number already. The fact that we're so far behind in terms of developing a military force that's got the weight and the reach and the hitting power. So we've gone over that. That's number one. And I say that's only number one because even though the probability of having to use such a force is so low, the consequence of not being able to deploy a force in our own defence. And on that point, Chris, the theory of defence self-reliance has, for those who are interested in this area, has been around for about 40 years. Bob Hawke championed it when Kim Beazley did his white paper. Defence self-reliance is actually a very simple concept. We should not expect anyone else to shed their blood in our direct defence if we're not prepared to be blunt, and it's a bit blunt, it's very blunt to be saying it, unless we're prepared to shed our own blood. In other words, we should only rely on ourselves and exclusively our own combat forces to defend ourselves in terms of immediate threats. Now, does it mean that we're not able to buy joint strike fighters or rely on American satellite intelligence? No, of course not. Everyone in coalitions fights using the enablers and the support services from their allies. But in terms of combat forces going into battle, God forbid, and hopefully never comes to it, we should be saying we need a force that's got enough weight that it could hurt the adversary to either deter them, or if they push past our deterrence, to hurt them so they pause, or we can take the punishment exclusively using our own forces. I call that the holdout strategy. It's what Britain did in 1940. They had to hold out, and they had the heroics of the Royal Air Force and their Spitfires and their Hurricanes until help arrived. We should have the moral fortitude and the strategic resolve to be prepared to do that. Now, we can also hope that it won't come to that, but hope is not a strategy. If it comes to it, we need to be prepared. So that's issue number one. Issue number two, which is linked to that, are these civil defence protections. Resource mobilisation, lack of fuel supplies, vulnerability of our cyber networks, the vulnerability of our submarine internet cables that could be cut. We need to address that as well. So it's not just having the military forces that can engage in combat, but having all of those other civil ancillary protections in place, which I label generically as civil defence. You can call it resilience, you can call it whatever you like. And that's about having a population and an economy that's prepared to endure. So in the same way that the military forces are engaging in sacrificial combat potentially and, saving the country, we also need to be able to be resilient for as long as possible, and indeed as long as it takes. And that will need fuel supplies. It'll need an ability to protect the population. We'll need to mobilise resources, as we did in the Second World War potentially. It'll mean that states and territories will have to work with the Commonwealth about redistributing medical and health resources. It's a huge amount of planning in the civil defence space that needs to be happening. Sitting underneath that is an economy that's got the productivity, the innovation and the industrial base to be able to support that. It doesn't mean we have to make everything here. It doesn't mean we have to start making microwaves like I mentioned earlier, but we need enough industrial capacity, whether it's making drones, making ammunition, building missiles to put into the inventory of the ADF. So we need an economy that can support that kind of strategy of resolve and that strategy of holding out. And then ultimately, we need a population that is informed about these things, not scared or apprehensive or rattled in a way that is reckless, but that is informed. Just last week, if not last week, the week before, Sweden issued a pamphlet, both in physical form and online, to its population, what to do if war comes. And you go online, go to the Swedish, the ministry escapes me, but it's the Civil Defence Organisation of Sweden. It's a very good document. It's written in it's obviously written in Swedish, but unless you can read Swedish, you've got to read the English translation. It's a very good pithy document, and it's no different from the sort of documentation that would be put out about bushfires or how to be ready ahead of a cyclone. Now, Sweden's closer to the action. They've got a history they've been neutral for a long time, but they've got a history of conflict around them. They've now gone into NATO. Sweden's not having a national nervous breakdown that their government's released such a document. In fact, they released an earlier version of this in 2018, and now they've updated effectively a pamphlet on civil defence, what to do in your family, what to do in your neighbourhood, and also for businesses, what to be prepared to do as part of these civil defence preparations. Could you imagine the government here, like out of the blue, the Prime Minister or a Minister for Home Affairs standing up saying, oh, by the way, today we're launching our pamphlet on civil defence called If War Were to Come?
No, because we haven't prepared the population for it. We haven't had an adult conversation with them about what the circumstances
Now, you don't need
are.
to be beating the drums of war. You don't need to be engaged in scaremongering or be accused of that at least. It's an area of policy and public administration that can be dealt with like anything else in policy and public administration, without hysteria, without flamboyant claims, without sentimentality and irrational debate. It just needs to be broken down into its constituent technical parts. Now, it's a big topic, and it's quite a bracing topic to be talking about. Look, the possibility, 5, 10, maybe 20% tops, that we might be in a war in the next few years. That's very bracing. But you either say, as the government's inclined to say sometimes, we live in the most dangerous, threatening, perilous times since the Second World War, which is a big claim, and then say, oh, but by the way, we've got some kit arriving in the 2040s. Well, you've got to be able to square that somehow. And it seems to me there are a number of steps that can be taken which are proportionate, they're reasonable, they're calmly explained, which gets you, if not quite to the Swedish level of here's a pamphlet, Chris, tomorrow on what to do if war comes, but builds you to that point where people go, okay, I'm not, I'm apprehensive. I don't want to die. I don't want my country to be, ruined by war. But I'm prepared to engage in a discussion and to do the things I need to do, which could involve expanding the reserves, giving people, reserve military training. There could be all sorts of things that we could be doing now that are cost-effective, proportionate and reasonable, and which don't, if you like, get sucked up into a political vortex of either you're too soft on these issues, or you're too hard, or you're beating the drums of war, or you're not beating the drums hard enough. If we just strip all of that back and just break it down to a public policy and administration problem, I think we'd be better prepared.
Well, Mike Pezzullo, it's always an education when I talk to you. I'd like to thank you for your service, by the way, over a lifetime. And I think you're still a young man because you are younger than me. And it's actually good to have your voice now outside of government saying these things, because there aren't enough people with your kind of experience saying them. So thank you very much. There's a lot more that we could talk about. I might invite you at some stage to come back again, and I hope that you will. So thank you.
I'd be delighted. Thanks, Chris. Thank you.